Well, greetings, everybody, and welcome to the 8th Quarterly National Adaptation Forum webinar, focusing on climate adaptation monitoring and evaluation. My name is Alex Gore. I'm a scientist with EcoAdapt, and I will be moderating this webinar today. These webinars are held quarterly so we can continue discussing on how to move adaptation forward in between our biannual Adaptation Forum gatherings. If you'd like to recommend a topic or are interested in partnering with us and co-hosting a webinar, please email me at alex@ecoadapt.org. Before we get started, I just want to go through some quick housekeeping rules to ensure a successful webinar. Please place your telephone and cell phone or computer on mute. This will help reduce feedback. If you're using the microphone voice over IP, you're automatically placed on mute, but please also ensure that your computer is on mute. We will have plenty of time after the presentations for question and answers. Throughout the webinar, you can use the question function to submit your questions to presenters. And at the end of the 3 presentations, we will be answering those. You can also use the raised hand function, and we can unmute you and you can ask questions directly to our presenters. You can also use the chat function to report any technical issues or problems you might be encountering during the webinar. We will try our best to help you address any problems to ensure you have a favorable webinar experience. The chat function can also be used to communicate between attendees as ways to emphasize the point heard during the presentation, also to engage with your fellow colleagues, so make it as interactive as possible. And finally, I wanted to let you know that the webinar is being recorded. It will be posted in the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange website for future viewing, takex.org, and the presentations will also be available online as PDFs in EcoAdapt's website at ecoadapt.org/webinars. Without further ado, I will introduce our panel members. So we have 3 great panel members here today. The first one is Rachel Gregg. She's a lead scientist and fellow colleague here at EcoAdapt. She has over a decade of experience in the application of natural and social science and management. Rachel created and manages EcoAdapt's State of Adaptation program and serves as the content editor for CAKE. She has served as an expert in different capacities, including acting as a reviewer for the IPCC 5th Assessment Report, contributing author to the National Climate Assessment, and member of the U.S. Urban Adaptation Assessment Advisory Committee. Her professional and educational experience have been primarily focused on management strategies for natural and human influences, including water quality, degradation, coastal hazards, environmental justice, and climate change. Ann Carlson is our second speaker. She is a climate associate for the Bozeman, Montana office of the Wilderness Society. She works on designation campaigns and climate change issues through landscape-scale adaptation projects. Prior to joining the Wilderness Society in 2009, Ann spent a decade developing conservation projects on a wide variety of mammal species across Africa and Southeast Asia. And last but not least, Mallory Morgan is a recent graduate of the Scripps Institution of Oceanography with a master's in advanced science in marine and biodiversity and conservation. Mallory now serves as a climate fellow at the San Diego Foundation and the Coastal Impacts Intern at the San Diego Climate Science Alliance. Mallory takes highly interdisciplinary approach and believes in multi-stakeholder engagement processes. She's now focused on building a resilient, healthy, and vibrant community where she now resides in San Diego, California. And without further ado, Rachel, you're on. Welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, and thanks, Alex, for inviting me to be part of this webinar today. I think I have access now to the slides. Yep. So as Alex mentioned, we both work for EcoAdapt. And for those of you who don't know who or what EcoAdapt is, we're a nonprofit based in the Seattle region, and our mission is to try and help people figure out how to do what they do effectively despite a changing climate. So we do that by providing support, training, and assistance to try and make planning and management less vulnerable. One of the ways we do that is through our 5 programs, one of which is the State of Adaptation that Alex mentioned earlier. It's a sustained research initiative to try and find out how people are thinking about climate change on the ground, synthesizing trends, opportunities, and challenges, and developing case studies and other products to help connect people to the reality of climate change and find out how they might mimic other practices that are happening in regions nearby. So we have been mapping adaptation projects, people, and services since 2009. One of the things we have asked from the beginning of all of our surveys and interviews that we have done, from marine and coastal North America to the Great Lakes, the Western US and Canada, marine fisheries in the Southeast United States, is we've asked people how they engage with monitoring and evaluation. In our survey, we found that there are a lot of different ways that people engage in different aspects of the adaptation process. These are a couple of examples of adaptation planning frameworks that some of you may be familiar with, all of which include some element of monitoring and evaluation. So obviously, monitoring and evaluation is really good for a couple of things. One, it can demonstrate correlations between climate and environmental changes. It can help you assess your climate change impacts on natural and built systems and communities. It can help provide early warning signals that can indicate a need for management intervention. It can highlight intended and unintended outcomes of whatever your planning and management strategies are. And also can help you evaluate effectiveness, efficiency, equity, and sustainability of your adaptation strategies and actions. So in our survey, we've come across a couple of different types of monitoring and evaluation. Some people are assessing the effects of climate change. Some are evaluating how climate change affects the management or planning goal. Some are prioritizing and deciding between adaptation strategies. And finally, determining if their implemented actions are working. Ideally, in an adaptation process, we would be doing all of these types of monitoring and evaluation. So I wanted to give a couple of examples of projects that we have uncovered in our surveys that address these different categories. So the first is assessing the effects of climate change. So you can think of climate impact assessments. One example is in the North Pacific. The North Pacific Climate Regimes and Productivity Program tracks climate change impacts and effects on fisheries in the Gulf of Alaska and Bering Sea. They're assessing and predicting climate-induced changes, developing climate models, tools, and resources that can be used by the North Pacific Fishery Management Council in their decisions. The converse of assessing the effects of climate change on your project is assessing the effects of your project on climate change. So this is something where the NEPA analyses really come in handy. So evaluating the effects of your proposed projects on greenhouse gas emissions and carbon cycling processes, including direct, indirect, and cumulative effects. The second category includes things like vulnerability and risk assessment. So one example of this is in Minnesota. The moose population has decreased by over 50% in the last 6 years because of changing temperatures, habitat shifts, and disease. Voyageurs National Park is using GPS collars to try and track the effects of climate change on moose population and distribution because it has been such a dramatic decline. They really want to try and document this behavior and any potential thermal refugia so they can make sure to identify those vulnerable lands that need protection. The third category deals with the creation, prioritization, and evaluation of adaptation strategies that you can implement. One example is during the 2008 Reef Resilience Conference in Florida. Participants tried to develop strategies that could be used to deal with changing temperatures and coral bleaching that have major effects on the reef system there. The participants ranked all of these strategies by their utility, their feasibility, and their effectiveness. And the final result is the Climate Change Action Plan for the Florida Reef System, which is a compilation of all of these prioritized actions. The final category is much less developed in practice. This is the determine if your adaptation strategies are working. So this is where we need to focus a lot of our effort. And a lot of the examples connected to this particular strategy are in terms of adaptive management approaches. So the example I've provided here is the Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge in North Carolina, which is very vulnerable to sea level rise, storm surge, flooding, and saltwater intrusion. And a partnership there is testing 3 different strategies that could potentially make the shoreline more resilient to sea level rise. They're using oyster reefs, water control structures like tide gates, and planting salt and flood tolerant vegetation, and trying to test a combination of which strategy or combination of these strategies will be most effective to make the shoreline more resilient. There is some emerging guidance on monitoring and evaluation, but most of it is based around development, how you're using funds to implement a lot of these strategies, because people want to track how you're spending your grants, which makes a lot of sense. But one of the things that we're doing is trying to document how people are engaging with the different categories, different types of monitoring and evaluation. So I would really like to encourage all of you, if you have an adaptation project, to please submit it. We would get those on CAKE as soon as possible. In addition, we have an adaptation monitoring survey so that we can see how you are actually engaging in which specific category, so that we can try and create a monitoring and evaluation specific state of adaptation report to try and provide an analysis of trends and opportunities and challenge in the monitoring and evaluation field specifically. EcoAdapt encourages everybody, and we try and incorporate monitoring and evaluation into every vulnerability assessment and planning process that we work on. But we've also developed a separate category of our projects that focus on monitoring and evaluation, and these are a couple of examples listed here. We've done everything from helping people create monitoring frameworks to figure out how to track climate change, to helping develop metrics to inform adaptive action in the Central Puget Sound region, and then the evaluation and assessment of that climate action plan that was created for the Florida Reef System, which Mallory is actually going to talk about today. I wanted to talk a little bit more specifically on one of these particular projects that I worked on, which is the Climate Adaptation Indicators Framework for the City of Boston. There are a couple of different steps involved here. One was conducting literature review on adaptation indicators that are used in different sectors and across the world. The second was identifying sectors in Boston that are impacted by or are addressed through climate change adaptation efforts. The third, developing a comprehensive list of potential indicators, and then finally developing a climate change adaptation specific indicators framework for Boston. So this was a partnership between the City of Boston, the Boston Harbor Association, C-Plan, and EcoAdapt. So one of the things that we tried to stress was that there should be a couple of characteristics or criteria for adaptation specific indicators for the city. So one is that they should be clearly linked to Boston's articulated climate adaptation priorities, whether that's reducing vulnerability, coordinating between government agency responses, improving emergency response, et cetera. The second is that they should be focused on changing conditions, and also, as much as possible, try to be inherently adaptive and flexible. The third was to create top-level or overarching indicators that could capture a number of important adaptation topics. We would like them to aim to complement the mitigation goals outlined in the Boston Climate Action Plan to try and decrease the rate and extent of climate change, avoid maladaptation, and include process and outcome indicators. So I just wanted to give you an example of the top-level targets that we encourage the city to look at, from institutional planning, capacity, and coordination, to climate science and information, public stakeholder engagement and awareness, public health and safety, natural resources and coastal infrastructure, and public and private buildings and utilities. So what we did is we took each one of those targets, provided an indicator assessing the degree to which that top-level target will be affected by climate change and increased extreme weather events, provide a description of what that means, and then give sub-indicators or metrics. So what I've done here is sort of provided a shortened version for you all to see. So these sub-indicators and metrics are obviously not representative of the entire framework, but just some examples. So for the degree to which planning capacity and coordination to effectively prepare for and respond to climate change and extreme weather events is in place, we recommended things like measuring the number of climate resilient emergency shelters per square mile and the percentage of people reached by early warning systems for hazards and other climate influenced emergency events. For the degree to which information and data are available and used to adequately address climate change and related events, we suggested measuring things like the studies conducted on vulnerability, the scenarios that are available to assess sea level rise, data that's available to assess temperature effects, et cetera, and also the extent to which all of that information is used to inform responses to climate change. For public stakeholder engagement and awareness, we suggested looking at the percent of at-risk households who are in floodplains that hold flood insurance policies, and the fact that climate smart education and awareness is delivered to the public in a variety of formats by a variety of people. For the degree to which Boston residents are vulnerable to climate-related health risks and have access to needed services and amenities, we recommended things like access to critical services is reliable during extreme events, that there are clear links between emergency resources and vulnerable populations, that the percent of emergency shelters in vulnerable areas of the city is increased and measured, that they measure number of disease outbreaks and climate-related illnesses and prevention measures are included in ongoing health programs, and that there's a development of a comprehensive food security plan that can be in use during emergency events. For the degree to which natural systems are able to withstand the impacts of climate change, we recommended considering the amount and type of land cover preserved as open space, the extent and condition of natural systems, and the number of riparian or natural buffers that are included in capital projects and development that can hopefully buffer some of the effects of climate change on Boston. For the degree to which public and private buildings and utilities are adequately prepared, we suggested measuring the percentage of assets at or above their loading limits during peak demand periods, the percentage of new development designed to withstand sea level rise, perhaps as they're elevated buildings, the number of buildings with reduced coastal risk due to coastal restoration projects that ameliorate storm surge and flooding. So next steps for that particular framework, it is a draft framework, and the Boston Harbor Association is now working with the City of Boston to finalize and integrate those indicators into the Climate Action Plan. And the next step is to, after that, is to then work with the city, state, and others to try and secure funding and staffing to implement the monitoring, which is, of course, a major barrier for any monitoring and evaluation project. So lastly, I just want to encourage you again to submit your adaptation project so that we can include it in our ongoing State of Adaptation initiative. Take the adaptation monitoring survey, the link is right there, so that we can include you in our State of Adaptation monitoring and evaluation specific report, which we hope to release next year, to read or request a State of Adaptation survey and synthesis project, and finally to join CAKE and submit your content. And please feel free to contact me if you have any questions. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you so much, Rachel. Yes, Anne, please, you're next. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks everyone for the opportunity to talk with you today. I'm going to be focusing on 3 specific examples of monitoring programs that a suite of partners and I have been working to develop and implement as part of a shift to adaptive management programs, and trying to convey some of the lessons learned through that process. Next slide, please. So to do that, I'm going to start orienting you to the part of the world where we've been running these experiments, and that is the crown of the continent, which is an 18 million acre landscape that borders northwestern Montana and Canada. It's an area of unusual ecological integrity in that it has no known extinction since Lewis and Clark first traveled through the area 200 years ago. It's also incredibly important to the whole continent in terms of providing water, and it has a lot of incredibly important habitat for a wide range of species that people really value. Simultaneously, though, it does have a lot of restoration needs, which range from noxious weeds and invasive species to old logging roads, previous mining activity, and decades of fire suppression, and of course, climate change. And so the context for much of this work was the Southwestern Crown of the Continent Collaborative, which is a 10-year federally funded suite of restoration projects that occur on Forest Service land. And so that's what I'll be talking about, and you can see it outlined here in red. Next slide, please. So the first natural resource target that we focused on as part of this project were 3 species of forest carnivores: Canada lynx, wolverines, and fisher. And the reason is that through this long-term federally funded restoration program across these 1.5 million acres of Forest Service lands, there was an additional legal mandate that all of the restoration activities needed to be coupled to a monitoring program. And there was great interest on the part of the Forest Service and all of our partners in facilitating this shift to adaptive management of threatened and endangered species. And so these three really rose to the top in terms of priorities. And so the way that we did this was to conduct a baseline survey that has lasted 4 years now. I'll be talking about data from 3 of the years because we haven't finished analyzing data from this year. But you can see in the map that's inset that we divided the whole southwestern crown into 5-mile by 5-mile grid cells, and then really thoughtfully and intentionally deployed our survey effort across those grid cells in a way that made sense and that we reviewed and made choices about every single year, with the idea being that periodic surveys will then be conducted at 4 to 5 year intervals. And the larger map shows you how we used a combination of multi-species bait stations, snow track surveys, and both camera and video surveys to try to get at some of the main monitoring questions. Next slide, please. So I'll talk briefly about some of the successes and challenges of this work over the course of the last 4 years. One of the big successes in the minds of my partners and me certainly has been the application of consistent methodology across the 1.5 million acres, which spans 3 different national forests. We've also worked very carefully to identify and implement cost savings along the way, because as you all know, monitoring work is very expensive, and we were really interested in trying to see how much we could reduce the costs. The results have also been a major part of the success story for this group, in that we've really been able to identify a lot of new individuals that were not previously known. So Canada Lynx, for example, which is represented in the yellow in the lower left map, 18 individuals have been identified across the 1.5 million acres, and using genetic analyses to get down to individuals, 13 of which were new to regional genetic databases. The story for wolverine, which are depicted in the upper left sort of bluish-green map, is the same, with 15 individuals being detected, 12 of which were new to regional genetic databases. Now, fisher, the distribution of habitat for which I've shown in the map on the upper right, we have not detected over the course of 4 years, despite very intensive efforts in over 5,000 miles, for example, of snow track surveys. One of the major challenges is trying to assess at what point in an intensive survey you feel you have enough statistical power and inference to say, we don't think that this thing or target is here. And that's also a huge challenge, I think. This also points out the fact that if you have species that are very rare or not distributed very well across the habitat, that you end up with a very weak inference for assessing the effectiveness of management actions, as opposed to, say, if we had chosen to monitor pollinators, where we would have had much stronger inference. And lastly, we also think that this highlights the challenges of trying to detect shifts in distributions that may be occurring as climate change accelerates. Next slide, please. The second natural resource target I'll talk about is cold water ecosystems. Specifically, we really focused quite heavily on Forest Service road systems and stream systems at the watershed scale on these public lands. And why is because we are all aware, I think, of the fact that there are very high densities often of road systems on our public lands, and these are depicted for the southwestern crown in the map that's inset. And so there was a focus for the restoration work on improving water quality in streams by locating and treating point sources of sediment. This is also related to climate change impacts as we move into the future, where we expect, as just one example, to have a higher frequency and larger severity of things like late winter floods, which can really exacerbate, for example, culverts that are really blown out and need to be replaced and are dumping a lot of sediment into the stream. And there's a photo of that inset as well. So the way that we did this is we worked collaboratively with a large number of partners across the western U.S., in the USGS, the U.S. Forest Service, universities, and NGOs to develop very detailed road and stream inventory mapping procedures using two tools. One is the Geomorphic Road Analysis Inventory Program, which I'll call GRAPE, and the other is Packfish In-Fish Biological Inventory, which is called PIBO. And these are sets of GIS tools that can be utilized to analyze these road-related risks. Next slide, please. The successes and challenges are also, there's some things that fall into each pot. So some of the successes include the fact that these data provide highly quantitative baseline data sets. Teams walk every mile of the roads across these watersheds and map where sediment has been seen leaving the road, and then track it to see where it actually makes it all the way down into streams, because sometimes it's connected to streams and sometimes it's not, as well as looking at potential for landslides or where culverts are blown out and a number of other factors. We also used erosion plots to calibrate all of these models so that we had real erosion data to allow us to say, for example, in this map that you see, how many kilograms of sediment were estimated to be leaving the roads and connecting into the streams at various points along the road system annually. It really allows you to just transform discussions about whether or not roads are bad or good, which is an opinion-based discussion, into an information-based discussion about where you may want to invest scarce resources to address problems that you and the general public, for example, have consensus about in terms of being significant. It's also easy to overlay GIS layers. For example, you can put native trout populations overlaying on this. You can also use stream temperature data sets. And in this way, you can really think very carefully about what matters to you and all of the stakeholders in the area and how you might want to move forward. The challenges, as always, include the fact that this is initially expensive work, although after you complete the baseline data sets, there are significant cost savings. It also takes 10 to 15 years to detect a signal from restoration and climate adaptation management actions in watersheds. And then thirdly, there's very high noise to signal ratio for aquatic ecosystems. And for that reason, these kinds of long-term data sets are especially helpful. Next slide, please. I'll just touch on noxious weeds pretty briefly. The focus here was 10 species of noxious weeds, and this is conducted at the scale of the entire crown of the continent. And the reason is, of course, because noxious weeds are a major threat to ecosystem structure and function, as well as native wildlife populations, both now and into the future. So essentially what my partners and I did was to work to collaboratively pool data sets about noxious weeds to establish current distributions across the entire crown. And we chose the 10 species by polling managers across the whole crown as to their priorities and how they were spending their money, and we just asked them which species they'd like us to focus on. We then worked with a climate modeler to develop the first ever future distribution maps for these 10 noxious weed species under 2 different climate scenarios, and then had workshops that have really allowed us to think about how we might want to strategize for transboundary monitoring and develop and implement management strategies. And that's turned out, of course, to be incredibly important as the climate changes, given that this is a large-scale stressor. And as you can see from this map of jurisdictions, even a landscape of 18 million acres is very heavily fragmented jurisdictionally. And therefore, working together is really the only path going forward. Lastly, as always, it's long-term work, and noxious weed work is very expensive. Next slide. So hopefully you're not dozing off here like this little owl, but I just wanted to dive back into a couple of lessons learned that we have really gleaned through these years of effort on these different natural resource targets. The first is that if I invited everybody on the call to come on over to my house to play football after the talk, some of you would likely show up dressed for one sport while the rest of you may be dressed for another. And so it's really important, we found, to have very explicit discussions about what you mean by the word monitoring, because we tend to use it in very different ways. And we've now added to the list of publications that talk about this. And here's just a couple examples. Implementation monitoring for us means whether or not you carried out the treatments that you agreed to in a particular project area. Effectiveness monitoring is whether or not, or the kind of monitoring you do to evaluate the effectiveness of your management actions on particular natural resource objectives that you've established together. Ecological effects monitoring is what we call when you're trying to do something good and you do something bad by accident. So were you spraying noxious weeds with herbicide and the herbicide got into nearby streams and killed the native salmonids and aquatic macroinvertebrates? Or were you taking out a road that you identified as contributing significantly to in-stream sediment loads and accidentally in the process introduced a bunch of noxious weeds through the bulldozers? So it's that kind of monitoring. And then you can move through things like surveillance monitoring or efforts to detect climate change impacts. And one of the big take-homes here is the idea that you are likely to have very different geospatial scales at which you may need to address each of these monitoring questions, with surveillance and climate change impact monitoring occurring at very large scales frequently, while implementation monitoring can occur at very small scales. Next slide, please. The second set of take-home messages is around the use of conceptual models. This is the one that we use to drive a lot of our monitoring discussions and development of monitoring protocols and focus for the aquatic ecosystem and roads work. And I realize that this discussion of conceptual models often sends people just running, looking for staplers or whatever else is handy that they can kill themselves with, because it's very painful and people often don't want to do it. I would just say that it's been very helpful to us in really helping us identify what it is that we're trying to monitor and why, as well as allowing us to have much more transparent discussions about how we see the system working, and then the use of those data to really help us modify our understanding of how the system operates. Next slide, please. And so lastly, we found it's been really important to be very, very clear about our monitoring objectives. With the mesocarnivore group, we took great pains to talk about the kinds of monitoring we're doing in relation to the question that we are asking. Could the data that we collected be used to, as a way to identify whether or not the species were present or absent, or to talk about their distribution, their population estimates, population viability, other questions? And then we really clearly said yes or no, we are doing this or we're not. We wanted to be very clear with each other, with our partners, and with supervisors about what we were able and not able to answer based on the amount of capacity and funding available through this particular monitoring program. And we found that to be very helpful. Next slide, please. And lastly, I'd just like to say thank you to all of my partners. I've been deeply blessed to work with a group of incredibly wonderful people and a lot of great collaboratives. And I guess that's the last take-home lesson, is that it really does take armies of people to carry out the kind of monitoring that we're talking about in an age of shifting climate. So thanks very much, and I'll turn it over to Mallory.
Great, thank you so much, Anne. Thank you, and Mallory, you're next. And then we'll take questions after Mallory is done. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. Thanks, Anne and Rachel. Those were great presentations. And thank you to EcoAdapt for having me here on this webinar. We're going to take a little bit of a left turn here, and I'm going to be talking about an evaluation of an action plan rather than an ecosystem. And as Anne mentioned, monitoring can be very expensive, but the value I'd like to show you today is that it can be done with limited time and resources, and that's what I did here. This was a capstone project done with a budget of $2,000 in the span of 3 months. So it can be done depending on what type of evaluation and monitoring you're doing. So this is a qualitative analysis of the climate change action plan for the Florida Reef System from 2010 through 2015. And I did this analysis this past year, so it was very timely as it was the last year in the action plan. So to give you a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about today, global climate change is happening, but it's being seen and realized at a very local level, for example, here in Florida. And so there's a direct need for adaptation and mitigation, so we create action plans to guide this, and we should indicate indicators and benchmarks in our action plan, but when there are not those benchmarks involved, qualitative evaluations like this can be done with multiple sources of information to create a scorecard and communicate the status and degree of implementation of that action plan. So as I mentioned, global climate change is absolutely occurring, as seen here through our thermal maps. We're experiencing extreme temperatures both in the air and in the ocean at extended periods of time, and this brings about several different changes in our environment. For example, even though it's a global issue, like I said, it's happening at a very local level, for example, in my hometown of Cocoa Beach, Florida. So this is a map of my hometown, and the area in green is land that is currently above the high tide water line. But if you just fast forward 85 years, you can see that this land is inundated at high tide. But let's not talk about the future. Let's talk about today and right now. South Florida is experiencing these impacts already. This picture here is a picture in Miami, and this is what's called sunny day flooding. And essentially at extremely high tides, the ocean is coming up through the storm drains and flooding the streets, causing both safety and health hazards. So beyond coastal inundation, I'd like to talk also about the loss of coral reefs, which are truly an engine for the economy of Florida and provide great protection to coastal communities and infrastructure. This graph shows the loss of coral reefs throughout the Caribbean, and that top right graph there is the loss of coral reefs in Florida. From the years of 1996 through 2004, Florida reefs lost an estimated 44% of coral cover, and this is a major catalyst for this action plan. To give you an idea of what this looks like, this is Key Largo in 1975, and same reef today is Rebel. This is a picture of Florida's coral reef system. It's 300 miles long, so there are several different jurisdictions and management layers and many different people providing oversight of this ecosystem. So it can be a very complex management scheme to manage. So how do we manage such an interconnected system like many other ecosystems? This action plan that was created was it's important to understand it was a guidance document and not any regulatory or statutory power. So this action plan was created by the Florida Reef Resilience Program in 2009 to guide decision makers on how to mitigate and adapt to these different changes that are occurring, as just mentioned, loss of coral reefs, coastal flooding, and various other impacts. And the main three goals that this action plan sought out were to enhance reef resilience through effective management strategies, reduce the risk to vulnerable social human communities, and strengthen the scientific foundation of strategic management. So this action plan is extremely interdisciplinary as well. It covers both climatic stressors as well as local human-induced stressors. So not only did I have to evaluate a plan that reached across many different jurisdictional boundaries, but also across many different sectors. So this is your standard action plan process. If you can see here, first you start and you assess your ecosystem and what you plan to achieve through your objectives, and you typically would like to set benchmarks and indicators to track those objectives into your action plan, and you implement it and then evaluate along the way to continue the cycle. But this action plan, as you can see, the measuring indicators are dependent and inform your evaluation. So the evaluation depends upon those initial benchmarks. Unfortunately, this climate action plan did not include those benchmarks and those quantitative numbers, so this had to be a qualitative assessment. So through a series of in-person interviews, phone interviews, online surveying, and my own independent internet research, I collected as much information as I could about the 40 action items listed in this plan and assessed the status and degree of implementation of those action items. So I put some guidelines on my interviewees. First, basically what we did was I gave the interviewee the action plan, and we went action item one by one as they appeared in the order of the plan. And some of the interviews, we only discussed a subset of the action, and I told my respondent, if you are not aware of this action item, we can skip it, or please refer me to somebody that would be able to speak to this action item. So I put time frame constraints on the answers. The example that was provided to me on how this action item had been addressed was to only occur between the years of 2010 and through 2015. I asked for explicit examples with the dates of projects that were occurring to address this plan, this action item, and I asked them what their personal opinion of the extent of implementation of this action item was. There were three categories. It was either green, fully addressed, yellow, partially addressed, or red, not yet addressed. I also asked my respondents not to submit an online survey and to prevent duplication of responses and information, and all respondents were kept anonymous. However, I did record my in-person interviews with a GoPro so that I could later just transcribe information. So I conducted 14 in-person interviews. This was absolutely the most productive source of information throughout the process. I think a lot of insight was truly revealed throughout discussion, and it actually compensated for a lack of online survey participation, which I'll talk to. But it also reinvigorated a lot of strategies with these managers. Most of my respondents were selected as their professional position in the system. So mostly managers and natural resource managers. I also conducted 6 phone interviews so that my sources of information weren't restricted fully to the study site, and I could talk to as many people as I could reach in those 3 months. To give you an idea of what we did, basically, here is an inside look into the action plan, and we would read the action item and, again, categorize it green, red, or yellow. And we really had to break it down by the language. So every single word in the action language really informed how we would assess the status of implementation of that action item. So for example, action 122 says develop and implement a regionally inclusive marine zoning plan. So A suggests it must be one single zoning plan. So since there has not been one zoning plan established throughout 2010 through 2015 for the reef system, there was no way that action could be fully addressed. However, they are rezoning the bottom 2/3 and scoping for the northern 1/3 of the reef. So this action was deemed essentially yellow. The other input of information and source of information was online surveys. This was actually the most time-consuming part of the project. We spent months and months. I worked very tightly with my advisor, UCSD, who's a social scientist, so that we made sure that we didn't prime or frame our questions, and we wanted to keep it as objective as possible. And also we wanted to keep it short enough that there would likely be enough participation. So we created 3 different formats of the surveys. One was action items relevant to reef managers, one was relevant to researchers, and the third was fisheries managers. We incentivized the survey with a $50 gift card, but it turns out that most managers were unable to accept that because of legal requirements with their job, so that turned out we didn't use that gift card. I also put a lot of time into creating a contact list, and we sent it out to 150 people and only received 13 responses. To give you an idea of the people that did contribute information to this assessment, here this graph shows the different people, and if you see there, most of them would be federal members. This is because 2/3 of Florida's reef system is managed by Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, so there were several people that contributed from the sanctuary. So I put all of this information into a scorecard so that I could communicate to everybody in the reef user community the status and degree of implementation of this plan. I wanted to keep it very simple, and again, we did green, red, or yellow for these 40 action items, and I was very surprised actually at the results, and it turns out 80% of this action plan has been addressed to some degree, and 20% of this plan has not yet been addressed. So this is the scorecard. It has all 40 action items, and I also put a confidence interval with each action item to talk about the number of sources that contributed to its assessment and also the agreement among those sources. And I also included an appendix which contains all of the evidence and projects and data that I collected over those 3 months, and this is really the meat of the project, and I think it's extremely valuable because, as I mentioned, this action plan covers so many different issues and sectors. If anybody wants to learn about what's being done to address ocean acidification or sea level rise or dredging or coastal pollution, they can look into this appendix and see all the different management actions that are occurring. I also created an infographic scorecard, and this one is a little bit easier to digest and also gives a little look into the action plan itself, as well as highlights successes and opportunities within the plan. So all in all, I think not only was this project valuable to understand and know where we stand with this action plan and its action items, but it also allowed myself and the managers that I spoke with to really reflect and contemplate on how to design action plans in the future. You need to design action plans with really concrete, specific examples of daily actions that are taken at smaller temporal scales, and you need to include attainable and realistic goals. Also, of course, you should include quantitative indicators to measure success and track efficacy with clearly defined thresholds. So since there is no quantitative thresholds involved in this action plan to begin with, I had no statistical inferences to make, and this resulted in a qualitative design. And finally, the design of the plan really determines the quality of your evaluation. So that goes back to the language. It's very important to consider what your language is in the action item to produce your outcome. So as Anne and Rachel both mentioned, of course, there are several benefits of evaluation, no matter if you're evaluating in a more quantitative way, as Anne did, or in a qualitative way, such as this. It facilitates an awareness and mutual shared feeling that action is being taken throughout the community. For example, there was a polling here in San Diego, and we polled over 600 San Diego residents, and more than 2/3 believed that they identified with climate change, but then only 22% believed that their fellow neighbors believe in climate change. So if you can bring to light all the different people acting, I think it creates and builds on momentum in the community. It also lays a foundation for successful action plans moving forward. It assesses where you are and where resources should be invested in the future. It consolidates information across otherwise disjointed management policies and actions. that otherwise probably would not be communicated amongst each other. It pinpoints goals that may have changed over time, and benefits of evaluation also, I think a major strength is you can identify financial and temporal efficiencies for your next action plan, so learning what worked and what didn't, so we don't reinvent the wheel. And then finally, it re-engages with decision makers and managers. Like I said, throughout several of these interviews, several of the managers would say, oh, I forgot about that strategy. That's a really good idea. I'm going to bring that up at the next meeting. And so it really reinvigorates these strategies within not only in a policy framework, but really indirectly throughout the minds of the managers. Overall, again, if I were to do this again, I would say I would try to work to understand a better willingness to participate in the online surveys. And I still strongly feel that in-person interviews are the most powerful source of a qualitative assessment. If I had more time and ability, I would be able to code their answers, but I just do not have the resources for that. And then also I would like to invest in recording software for the phone calls. And that is all. And thank you very much to everybody in my community committee and Alex for being my advisor. And I really enjoyed this project, and I look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Mallory, for very thorough, very different presentations on evaluation and monitoring. The first question that I have received here is about communication. How do we properly communicate the lessons learned or the failures or the successes of evaluation and monitoring programs? So I think the question here is really emphasizing on if something failed, how do you properly communicate that? Will that then give us continued support or funding to continue those monitoring programs, or will that kind of backfire to us? And I'll open this to all three of you, whoever wants to answer first.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I don't have an answer. I don't have an answer, but I think the question of everybody wants lessons learned, or best successes, best failures. I don't really have an answer though, because I haven't seen any examples yet. But that's certainly something I'll look for in my project to try and see if I can find anything about that.
I mean, this is Mallory. I would briefly say that I think it's how you communicate those failures and the language. So rather than speaking to it being a failure, it's an area of opportunity, and it's where we can focus our efforts more so and come to the table with solutions and lessons learned. There's several lessons learned available on the CAKE website, and coming to the table with solutions and proven examples that have worked in other places.
This is Anne, and I'll just add that I think it is a really interesting question. I think it also scales, though, right? So the kinds of failures you may have may be different at different scales, and then the consequences, of course, may be different. But I think that if you have the ability to change the kind of monitoring that you're doing moving forward, and I think that is the point of a lot of the discussions that we've been having today, is to have adaptive management that is flexible and nimble and responsive to the kinds of things that you're learning as you go along. Then hopefully there's an opportunity to talk about how you're going to address those failures, which I would hope would then not jeopardize funding. But again, right, and specifics could be, I join Rachel in saying that I think the specific circumstances would matter.
Right, and I think it, if you could communicate it, if you can justify it as far as we monitored for success, this wasn't successful, and therefore it will be a cost-saving measure to try something else. I think that's really important. I think that's why we consistently advise that people think of adaptation strategies as more of an investment portfolio. You don't ever put all your money in one stock. You sort of spread it out across a couple of different options so that you're not, spending all your money on one strategy that may ultimately end up failing. So.
Oh, very good. Yeah, challenging. Those are challenging issues for sure.
Yeah.
So, kind of related is the financing mechanism. So, again, monitoring, even for, is never an easy thing to fund, even though Mallory was able to do it with very little money. How often should you monitor? And I know, again, it's dependent on scale, but if you have a strategy, is monitoring yearly, or could it be only done 5 years? And how do we ensure that there is that funding mechanism to continue monitoring throughout the whole life of your adaptation strategy, even if you're redoing or updating your strategies as you have your lessons learned? How often should you be actually doing a thorough monitoring and evaluation of your strategies?
And that's you.
That's Rachel. I'm thinking. I think again, it just goes to what it is that you're using the monitoring information for. So, if, for example, you're monitoring, let's just say it's forest carnivores because you're designing restoration projects and you're concerned about impacts that the actions themselves will have in the short term versus potential benefits in the long term, et cetera, then I think that ends up being very closely linked to the time frame for the project and your evaluation of success or failure of the project to achieve the goals you set out for it. I think if it goes to something like what, again, Rachel and Mallory were talking about, this much longer term in terms of climate impacts, then I think those are probably best done at larger intervals. So I think we could talk about it, with those kinds of frames. And then to get to the funding piece, I share your pain, absolutely. I think everyone on the call here recognizes the enormous challenges of trying to fund these incredibly important monitoring programs. And I know there are lots of grants that I apply for, and my partners do, that stipulate that they don't fund monitoring. And it's something that people really value tremendously, but they don't necessarily want to fund. They often want to fund the action piece of it. And I know that, for example, the Southwestern Crown Collaborative, that we're about to get into that in the next 5 years, because they gave us money to do restoration projects and monitoring for 10 years with the requirement that we monitor without them providing any funding for 5 years after the projects wrap up. And we have to figure out how to do that, and we haven't thus far. So I think we're all learning, but the more that this takes place and that we have these kinds of examples of the tremendous value, I think the more that it becomes something that is just part of normal everyday work, and that we can hopefully, start to work into budgets with less pushback.
Yeah, that's a very good approach. And this is it's kind of related, and also a comment. Citizen science has been used to monitor climate impacts on resources. Is that maybe a solution for monitoring and evaluation using citizen sciences? And is that an effective way of doing an evaluation and monitoring program?
So I wasn't sure if that was for me or others, but this is Ann, I'll jump in. And I'm wildly enthused about the potential for citizen science, and we've certainly used it in the Southwestern Crown in a variety of ways. Sometimes it's not possible, I think, to do safely, like on the mesocarnivores. People are on snowmobiles in very remote backcountry places, and I think there's considerable safety issues associated with it. But I know that there are increasingly more and more apps that you can get on your phone to do things like, for example, EcoAdapt allows you to record calls from the night sky that go directly into a national database and are identified through the sonograms in the computer program, which really cuts down on error rates and really significantly increases the usability of those data sets. And I think that we're really getting to a point in time where these kinds of programs are going to take off increasingly. And I know we do citizen science with high schoolers and middle schoolers, as well as anyone who's interested on field tours. And I really think that there's an enormous value in doing that for all the reasons I think that Mallory was just laying out before. But I think it's really careful, deep thinking about how you train the people you're working with so that you have usable, consistent data if you're not going to have it, going through some kind of an app that really does that for you.
Yeah, I was going to say the same, that it's sort of, I think the most successful examples of citizen scientist monitoring projects have pretty established protocols that people are asked to follow, and then they provide free training to people to come in and figure out how to actually and accurately collect and assess data, which is great. And there's a couple, the King Tides project in Washington State is something that people can look into. There's the coast seabird and shorebird surveys that have been really successful over the years. So there are some really good examples, and it's probably just a matter of trying to synthesize those and see what we can learn from them.
Okay, very good. Our time is up, but I'm going to allow the 3 panel members just to one final thought, and then we will finish the webinar. So Rachel, any final thoughts on evaluation and monitoring?
Yeah, my final thought is totally understand that adaptation is itself sometimes a beast to grapple with, and that adding another component of monitoring and evaluation on top can be difficult. But to me, it really seems that if we get these lessons learned, best practices, worst failures, whatever you want to call them, the faster we're going to learn and learn from each other. So I would encourage you to share any insight you have with me. I don't have a $50 gift card to give you, but but you'll get my eternal thanks. So hopefully, Alex, we can send out that link to everybody who is on the call today.
Absolutely.
That would be great.
Absolutely.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Rachel. Anne, any final thoughts?
I'll say that, again, I think that collaboration is really the key to moving forward. These are incredibly challenging things to do together, and the greater and more diverse the group, I think the more quickly you're going to get to a point where you feel pretty good about what you're proposing to do and are able to come up with ways that you can fund it and match and leverage funding among all of the partners. And so I can't say enough how great it is to do this work with lots and lots of partners. And I'm also, my email was up there very briefly, but I'm also more than happy to answer any questions following this at any point in the next, in the future. So feel free to get in touch if I can be of help.
Great. Mallory, any final closing remarks?
Yeah, I would just like to second what Anne said about leveraging funding and partners, and a lot of us are all doing the same work, and any opportunity you can to collaborate and also couple projects and integrate monitoring into your day-to-day activities, I think would be beneficial. And climate change adaptation doesn't have to be its own separate piece that we deal with. I think it's really just an umbrella of things that we're all already dealing with and facing, and can couple into daily activities.
Great. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. Just a quick reminder, these are quarterly webinars. If you have any recommendations or want to partner with us, we are happy to entertain your proposals. You can email me at alex@ecoadapt.org. And hopefully during our November webinar, hopefully we'll be able to release the location and dates for the 2017 National Adaptation Forum. Yes, we have already started planning. So a lot of exciting things coming in fruition in the next few months. So thank you guys again, and this webinar will be on cakex.org, and we look forward to seeing you next time in November. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.